Welcome to another episode of Realcast, where we dive into the world of fishing with some of the most respected and knowledgeable anglers out there. Today, we have a very special guest who's a true legend in the fishing community. Steve Starlo Starling is a name that resonates with every angler in Australia and beyond. Steve has become one of the most influential figures in the fishing industry. He has authored more than 20 books on angling, written thousands of articles, and produced numerous instructional videos. Today, Steve continues to share his passion and knowledge through his online platforms, including his YouTube channel, Starlo Gets Real, and his engaging social media presence. His dedication to educating and inspiring anglers of all levels is evident in everything he does. In this episode, we'll talk to Steve about his incredible journey in the fishing world and his favorite fishing techniques, memorable fishing stories, and the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the sport. So sit back and get ready for exciting conversation with the one and only Steve Starlo Starling. Welcome.
Thank you. What a build-up. I hope I can live up to it.
Exactly. Can you remember the first time you went fishing? Where was it and who were you with?
Yeah, well, I went fishing with my parents, I guess like a lot of people did for the first time. My old man was a policeman and he got transferred around New South Wales quite a bit. And when I can first remember going fishing was at Condobolin, which is out in the actual geographical centre of New South Wales. Condobolin is the closest town to being in the very centre of New South Wales. And we lived there in the early 60s. I was a very young whippersnapper, and my mum and dad used to go out onto the Lachlan River and just fish with hand lines off the bank. I still remember wrapped on the old Coca-Cola bottles, the one that had the taper in the middle, and they'd wrap the nylon line around the middle, and you'd have a sinker and a hook. No swivel. You had a broken off matchstick as your stopper for your sinker. And the first couple of times we went fishing, they caught very little. I think a couple of little silver perch. I caught nothing. I got bored and wandered off and didn't catch anything. And then my mum actually won a little rod and reel on the old chocolate wheel at the local fair or the show or whatever. And it was a little solid fiberglass rod about 4 foot long with one of those closed face reels on top, the push button ones with the hole in the front and the line comes out. And it was already pre-rigged with a little green Wonder Wobbler lure, probably an imitation Wonder Wobbler. It probably wasn't even an original. And she gave it to me, and I learned in the backyard how to cast it, press the button and flick it, and the lure would fly out. And I thought that was pretty cool. It was a lot more exciting than having a Coke bottle with a hand line wrapped around it. So the next time we went fishing out on the Lachlan River at a spot called Gum Bend, I wandered off while they were sitting there with their hand lines, and I'm flicking this Wonder Wobbler out and reeling it in and watching it come twinkling through the water. And I was just absolutely fascinated. And the next minute, a really weird thing happened. A redfin perch, about half a pound, shot up and ate the Wonder Wobbler when it was right at my feet. And it just scared the bejesus out of me. I stopped winding and ran backwards up the bank and dragged the redfin flapping up through the dust and the dirt and landed my first fish. And I was just absolutely smitten. The whole thing about lure fishing and the fact that I'd conned a fish into eating a bit of metal and then I'd actually managed to land the fish. That was it. It was all I could think about from then on was going fishing.
Exactly. That's such a similar story. My first time ever going fishing was actually at a river very close to where you live. I was actually too scared to get on the boat. So my uncle owned a caravan down south, and we went on holiday down there, and I was too scared. Didn't want to get on the boat. I was almost forced onto the boat. And once I got out there and went fishing, it was just fish after fish for me. From my memory, they were huge fish, but they're probably only 5-6 centimeter fish. But in my world back then, when I was very, very young, it's such a cool thing. And still to this day, something that I still remember,
I don't think you ever forget that first fish.
No, I don't think anyone will ever. Who is the biggest influence on you when you were fishing, when you were learning to fish?
Well, yeah, so then a couple of years passed, we moved around New South Wales a bit more, and then we ended up down on the far south coast in Bega, and I got right into my fishing out on Tarstra Wharf, and anyone who knows that part of the world will know the old steamer wharf at Tathra. They've just recently done it up again. It was starting to get a bit dilapidated. It's older than me. It's well and truly older than me. It's about 150 years old. But yeah, I used to go out there every weekend and fish off the wharf. And I started reading fishing magazines about that time. And I loved the work of Vic McChrystal. He was sort of my idol, I guess, in those days. And then in the late 60s, along came Ron Calcutt with the old Australian Angler magazine, which ultimately became Fishing World magazine. And he injected a real sort of new vibe into the whole fishing media game. Ron was a keen surfer and also a musician, so he used to read music magazines and surfing magazines, and that's what he transformed into the old Australian Angler. He used a lot of the style that was used in surfing and music magazines in those days. So it was much more oriented towards a younger market than the old outdoors magazines and everything. And I absolutely idolised that magazine, and I idolised Ron Calcutt as my guru. And to cut a long story short, I ended up working for him. That was my first job in the industry after training to be a school teacher and going out west school teaching for a year or so and deciding that I'd made a really bad career decision and that I really needed to be fishing. A job came up as assistant editor of the old Fishing World magazine, and I ended up at the tender age of 21 working for the guy that I'd idolised since I was about 16. So you can get lucky sometimes with your passions in life. But yeah, Ron would be Vic McChrystal before him, and then Ron Calcutt, and then later in my life, guys like Bushy. They're the people that have really sort of shaped my whole ethos towards fishing and taught me so much in the process.
Exactly. I remember as a kid going to the local newspaper store, getting the fishing monthly every month, making sure that I had enough money off mum and dad to make sure I had enough to buy it each month. And I would sit there for hours on end just reading the articles. And especially if it was an article that was something to do with what I do, fishing in Sydney. Yeah, it was just so cool, like just to have them all the time. What was the most important lesson you learned in those early fishing days?
Yeah, it's I guess. Well, I'll tell you, the day that it all came home to me that there was more to fishing than catching yellowtail and slimy mackerel off Tathra Wharf, and this would have been about 1969. So it was the very early days of land-based game fishing, and I never did find out who this guy was, but a fisherman that had all the gear. He had a lever drag overhead reel in a day when I'd never seen anything like that. And he walked down onto the wharf with his wife, and they would have been in their late 20s, early 30s, I guess. And they were obviously in the sport fishing movement, and they knew what they were doing. And they were going to live bait off Tathra Wharf, and I'd never seen anyone do that before. Anyway, I had a couple of live yellowtail in a bucket that I just caught, and they asked me if they could have them, and I said, yeah, absolutely. So the guy put one out on his gleaming, it was probably a Penn International or something like that. Might have been an Ev Roll or even a Polikansky, I don't know. And he put his out under a float. And his wife had an Albi sidecast. She obviously hadn't graduated to the lever drag overhead, but she put the other yellowtail out. Well, cut a long story short, it was her bait that went off. And after a very long fight, with a lot of dramas around the pylons and everything else, she landed a 50-pound long-tail tuna, northern bluefin as we called them in those days, 23 kilo fish. It was a magnificent fish, caught on the yakka that I'd caught. And the penny dropped that day that there's more to fishing than catching little stuff. You can turn little stuff into big stuff. And I started dreaming about having gear like that and being able to I was 11 or 12 at the time. But that I knew that was the sort of stuff that I wanted to ultimately do. So that was a pretty big lesson.
Yeah. Did you eventually go out and, replicate that and go land-based game fishing and be successful at that?
I sure did. From about 1973 until 1980, it was what I did nearly every weekend. By then, I was living in Bomaderry now on the south coast of New South Wales, and I'd got in with a group of guys my age and a little bit older. A couple of them had just got their licenses, so they had cars, and we were able to get out to the rocks and go spinning and then live baiting. And we just used to haunt Beecroft and Devil's Gorge and the tubes. And yeah, so I put the long hours in. It's a hard game, land-based game fishing, especially in those days. The gear wasn't up to what it is today, and we were madly into the answer movement. So we were fishing pretty light line. We used to live bait with 20-pound and even 12-pound line off the rocks, and we lost some cracking fish. But I caught a couple of yellowfin tuna and a long-tail tuna off the rocks, and then in January '79, I actually managed to land a marlin off the rocks at the tubes, which was a pretty big deal in those days. There'd only been about 20 of them caught at that stage. The first one was only caught about 6 or 8 years before that. And to actually land a marlin, only a little one, but that was probably the crowning achievement of my land-based game fishing career. And I really look back fondly on those days, but they're well behind me now because they were big walks and big climbs and carrying lots of gear. We used to carry the inflatable kids' pools in and pump them up and fill them up with water and catch the yakkers and the slimies and put them in those. And then you've got to carry the fish out if you do catch one. It's a young man's game, but it certainly taught me a lot. It was a wonderful apprenticeship for my fishing, that's for sure.
Exactly. I feel like some of those land-based game spots, especially the ones on the south coast that are famous across all of Australia, they're almost like if you land a marlin or a big tuna or something like that, there needs to be a plaque up on the wall right next to that spot of, your name and how heavy that fish was, because the journey is just as good as catching the fish, especially to a lot of those spots. Some of the stuff that people will go to and the lengths they'll go to be able to catch those fish in those spots is just absolutely phenomenal.
It is, and some of the fish they've landed in the years since then, we were catching 50 and 60-pound marlin off the rocks in those days and thinking we were doing really well. I mean, they've been caught to 130 kilos and stuff like that off the rocks now, and massive yellowfin tuna. The generation that came after me, Phil Atkinson and those guys, they just took it to a whole different level, and they were fishing proper gear, 50-pound tackle, which is what we should have been fishing off the rocks in those days because we got spooled on numerous occasions. And I fought a yellowfin there one day for close to 4 hours and had it circling on the surface about 150 metres out with its sickles out of the water. This is on 20-pound line. It had basically spooled me on its first run, and I managed to get it all the way back. And at the 4-hour mark, a boat came around the corner and went straight across my line. We're all waving and yelling, and they're waving and yelling back, going, "Hey, hi, here you go." They had no conception that we could be hooked up to something that was so far out off the rocks. But it was a heartbreak, that one. I used to wake up in a cold sweat for many years after that, thinking about that particular loss. But that's what brings you back.
Yeah, exactly. That's fishing. The ones you lose are the ones that always bring you back the next day. And the hardest sessions that you have are the ones that, motivate me to get out there and go at it again. Like, I think I've gone fly fishing 5 or 6 times now, and I would have spent upwards of 25, 30 hours, I reckon, on the water. I've had a few follows from salmon. I've had one almost eat it right at my feet. And I still haven't even hooked one yet. But just that drive and the fish that you miss just bring you back again and again.
For sure.
Moving on and moving a couple of years forward, then you start with your magazines and you're writing articles and you create a few books and stuff like that. But then you start heading to the big screen and start doing a few fishing shows and stuff like that. I guess, do you want to talk to the audience about all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, that's right. I started off with the writing, and in fact, I wrote my first article while I was still in my last year at high school and sent it off to Ron Calcutt at the Old Australian Angler, and it got published, and I was just a bit daunted after that. It took me a while to write another one because I didn't want to get one rejected. And I started writing reasonably regularly, and then, of course, ended up as, first of all, assistant editor and then editor of Fishing World magazine. I did that for 4 or 5 years through the early 80s, and then rather stupidly decided I'd go out and freelance. I was going to make a fortune writing fishing books and articles. That was pretty tough. Luckily, I was living in the eastern suburbs of Sydney at the time, and luckily I was able to catch blackfish off the rocks down at Bondi, and that's basically what I fed my family on. I had two small kids at that stage, and not a lot of money coming in, so I was catching a lot of blackfish and eating them. The writing was going pretty well. And I scored a couple of trips overseas, caught that big tuna in Canada, which we'll talk about later. and was really enjoying the whole fishing travel thing and the opportunities that it was presenting to me. And I actually got an offer of a job in Canada, editing a fishing magazine over there, a brand new magazine called Canadian Sport Fishing. And I thought that'd be pretty good fun. So I uprooted the family and moved to Canada and
Wow.
lived over there for just over a year and edited the magazine. I was going to stay about 4 or 5 years, but no one told me that winter was going to be 7 months long and it wouldn't get above zero. That was a bit grim. I'm not the best on cold weather at the best of times, and that was just way too much cold weather. So we ended up coming back after a year or so, and I basically walked straight back into the Rex Hunt phenomenon. Rex had just taken his show from being a Victorian only thing to national on Channel 7, and he was looking for anglers to go fishing with in other states. And luckily, his manager gave me a call and said, "Would you be willing to take Rex for a fish?" And I said, "You bet." So he came up and we had a fish together and got on really well. And I ended up on the show for the next 8 or 9 years with Bushy. And that really sort of, it was obviously a big boost to my career. And I went from being reasonably well known amongst a small number of really keen fishers to actually getting recognised in the street and stuff. It was just bizarre when you get your head on that little screen, the TV. It's amazing the difference that it makes to your life. And that was it was a whirlwind 8 or 9 years, and travelled again. Got to travel around the world. Went to Japan, went to England, went to Vanuatu, Fiji, New Zealand a couple of times, all with the show, Solomon Islands. Yeah, so that was pretty crazy. And then came home at the end of that when the show finally sort of wrapped up. I got back into the writing and a little bit more TV on some shows like The Great Outdoors and the Off-Road Adventure Show. Did a few stints on shows like that. And nowadays, I'm more than happy not to be in the television world. It was good fun, but it was a lot of hard work, a lot of travel, a lot of really long days. You're away from your family a heck of a lot. I actually really enjoy just being at home now and doing my own thing, and with my my YouTube channel, just going out and being my own boss, shooting my own stuff and editing it, and being a one-man band. I'm really enjoying that in the afternoon of my life. I just turned 66 a couple of weeks ago, and I like to say I'm semi-retired, but I'm probably working harder than I've ever worked before. But I'm also really, really enjoying it. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, exactly. Working hard and enjoying something at the same time is there's nothing more rewarding. And I guess talking about like you mentioned Bushy and stuff like that there. You and Bushy collaborated, I guess, together and created a soft plastic way back in the day around like Mr. Twisters and all that sort of stuff. Do you mind regaling the audience with a story about the creation of your soft plastics?
Yeah, well, the soft plastic thing's an interesting one because soft plastics have actually been around a lot longer than a lot of people realise. They were market at the very beginning of the 1950s in America, and we didn't get to see them in Australia until the 60s. And even by the time I was just sort of getting into sport fishing, there were Mr. Twisters and Vibratails, and they were already catching quite a few fish, particularly flathead down south and barra up north. And a lot of Aussie anglers, I think, thought that was about all they could catch. They didn't realise just how versatile soft plastics would turn out to be. And so they bubbled along. They weren't cheap here, whereas in the States and in Europe, they're fairly cheap. They were always quite expensive out here, so they didn't stand up to our toothy critters and tailor and toadfish and leather jackets and stuff. So they never really made as big a splash as they probably should have until the late 90s. And yeah, Bushy and we'd been working together on the Rex Hunt show, and we both, about the same time, just fell madly in love with the whole light tackle brim fishery, brim on lures. I mean, I'd caught a few brim on lures through the 70s and 80s, but going out and actually targeting brim on lures became a real thing. And we got involved in the early days of the ABT tournament circuit, where we're using little hard-bodied minnows and stuff like that to catch brim, and it was just a revelation to us that you could do it. Luckily, we had all the right gear arriving at the same time. The fine braided lines had just sort of landed, and we had really nice little lightweight graphite rods with sensitive tips that could cast those little lures, and the little spin reels. It was just everything just meshed together at the same time, and it's when we got hooked on this whole finesse fishing thing. And Vic McChrystal wrote way back in the 70s that anyone who can consistently catch brim on lures won't have too much trouble with any other species, and I really believe that. Brim are one of the trickiest things. And I run into people all the time that say, oh, yeah, I like my lure fishing. I can catch flathead. No worries. I can catch tailor. I can catch salmon. But geez, those brim, they've got me stumped. And that's the case with a lot of people. And I think being able to sort of get on top of that brim thing was a real coup and something that Bushy and I really enjoyed. And then we started applying the soft plastics thing to it. And some of your older listeners will remember at the time there was a product on the market called a bucket of bait. And it was a little plastic bucket with a lid on it with a whole bunch of soft plastics. I think they were all the rejects from the US, and someone was bringing them into Australia and putting them in this thing. And I think it was about $9.95 for this bucket of bait. Bushy and I used to buy them and rip them open, and we'd tear out rubber lizards that were this long and frogs and all the other stuff that we had no idea how to do anything with. But somewhere down the bottom, there'd be a couple of little curly tail grubs, little pink curly tail grubs, and we started catching brim on those. And it just took our brim fishing to the next level. We'd been able to go out and catch 6 or 7 brim in a day on the hard-bodied lures. Suddenly we were catching 16, 18, 20, 30 brim a day on these little soft plastics. And it was just mind-boggling. And I remember we did a filming gig with Andrew Eddinghausen, ET at the time. He wanted to go for a fish with Bushy and I. We went in Bushy's boat down on the far, far south coast of New South Wales. We took ET out. ET's a really gun fisher, by the way. One of those, like a typical sportsman. He's got amazing eye-hand coordination.
Yep.
His casting is really good. He just takes to anything new. He'd never done a lot of that style of fishing, and he took to it like a duck to water. And Bushy and I had made a little quiet agreement because we were only just discovering how good these little pink plastics that were in the bottom of the bucket of bait were. We were keeping it our little secret because we were going to fish these ABT tournaments, and we reckon we'd get 1 year in where no one else knew how good these soft plastics were. So we both agreed beforehand that we wouldn't show ET the soft plastics and we wouldn't put them on TV at that stage. So we're out there and we're throwing the little hard bodies. It was pretty tough. I think ET had caught one, I'd caught one, and Bushy had caught one, and we'd been quite a few hours out there. And I snagged my hard body and busted it off. And without saying anything, I just snuck over to the tackle box and put a little jig head on and put one of these little pink things on. And Bushy didn't see me do it. Next minute, I've cast out and I've gone, oh, I've got one. And when it came in, Bushy's looked at it and he's looked at me and he's just shaking his head. He's giving me the darkest look, And then I'm just banging them one after the other. And ET's going, what is that? What have you got on there? So, yeah, the cat was out of the bag. And it was still really hard to get the kind of soft plastics that you needed to catch brim on a regular basis. And serendipitously, at that very moment, the late John Dunphy, who was the Australian boss of Shimano at the time, came to Bushy and myself and he said, I see you guys have been getting into these soft plastics. He said, we've just linked up with the biggest soft plastic factory in China and they make stuff for Storm and Rapala and everybody else, and they're going to make some stuff for us. Would you guys be interested in designing them specifically for Australia? And we nearly knocked him over in the rush to say yes. And the next year or two was pretty interesting. It was all about prototypes and testing them and sending them back and getting it right. And then about the end of 2001, we launched the Squidgies brand onto the Australian market. It was always owned by Shimano Australia. Bushy and I were just employed to do the design work and then endorse the product and everything. And we went on the road then and did what we used to call the Squidgy tours or Squidgy nights. And we travelled all around the country giving these talks. And it was an amazing experience because you'd go to places where people would be very skeptical. They go, are you sure these things are going to work? And they'd look at them and we'd hand out packets of them. You'd come back to the same place 12 months later and the same guys and girls were coming up to you to show you their photos of the big flathead and the big brim and everything else and the snapper. and the dewies that they'd caught on the squidgies since we'd been there 12 months before. So they were really exciting times. It changed the face of Australian fishing. There's no doubt about that. And I mean, soft plastics are so entrenched in our fishing these days, but people don't realise that in 1999 it wasn't like that, and by 2005 it was like that. There was a revolution happened across those 5 or 6 years, and it was driven by the squidgies. And I'd like to think that Bushy and myself played a big part in it by getting out there and actually educating people on how to use soft plastics. And it's I think it's been a great thing. There's been a lot of fish caught as a result, and probably some pressure put on a few fish stocks. But we also used to really push the sustainable line as well, about only taking what you needed and putting fish back. And luckily, Rexy had already sort of got that across with his kiss 'em and let 'em go ethos across the previous 10 years. So there was a lot more catch and release going on. And yeah, so it's been an exciting, where are we now? 24. So, it's only like 25 years, and a lot has changed in Australian fishing in that time.
Exactly. 2005 you mentioned, it's quite a, I guess, pivotal year for me. I was 13 years old then, and that's when I first started lure fishing. Bought my first packet of squidgies and started fishing with them, little squidgy wriggler, still remember it, and casting it out and just seeing what happens. And that sort of started, I guess, my whole lure fisher journey, and I've been fishing lures pretty much religiously since then. So much so, I think my dad officially was like, oh, I think he can go fishing by himself now, because my dad is a ride and die bait fisherman. He will fish with lures here and there, but yeah, he was a ride and die bait fisherman. And once I started with those lures, I wanted to go all sorts of different places and not sit down and soak a bait in the water. I want to fish this whole beach and or this big sandbank or anything like that. And it was just, it was so cool for me. It definitely it increased that love and passion for fishing.
I think you hit it on the head with that, the analogy about sitting there and waiting for it to happen. And that was one of the things that Bushy and I used to tell people, because guys would stand up at a squidgy night and say, oh, yeah, but come on, mate, if I want to catch a flathead, a live potty mullet is going to catch a flathead better than those squidgies. And we used to say, yeah, absolutely. You put that live potty mullet in front of a flathead, it's going to eat it. But it's eaten it. And what are you going to do then? You put another live potty mullet out in that same spot, that flathead's not there anymore. But when you're soft plastic fishing, the analogy I like to use, it's the difference between setting a trap, which is bait fishing, and hunting, which is lure fishing, particularly soft plastic fishing. So when you set a trap, you set the trap and you sit there and you wait for something to find the trap and fall into it or get snared or whatever. And that's kind of what bait fishing's like. Whereas when you're lure fishing, you're out there actively hunting. And if there's no fish there, you move to there. And if there's no fish there, you move to there and you cover water. And to me, that's so much more interesting and exciting than anchoring yourself in the one spot and waiting for a fish to come along.
Exactly. It's a bit like it's all about the chase, you got to go chase and target those fish and find that good fish, because soft plastic fishing, you can catch a small fish or you can catch a really big fish as well, also all at the same time.
Absolutely.
Moving forward and looking a bit more towards the present, how's your approach changed from back in those days to when you were your first memory from fishing right up until now?
Yeah, I guess it's changed. Well, one of the dramatic things, when I talked about catching that first redfin and then falling in love with fishing, and then next birthday came along and Christmas, and all I wanted was fishing gear, so I used to ask for a rod or a reel or whatever. And when I got my first rod and reel that didn't come already spooled up with line, my idea was that I needed to buy the thickest line that I could find, because I wanted to catch big fish. I still remember going into Woolworths, and I don't know why I can remember this, but the heaviest line that I could find was 33 pound breaking straight, and it was like 100 metre spool. And the little spinning reel that I had wouldn't even take 100 metres of 33 pound line. And it was like fishing with barbed wire. And it was pretty ordinary line back in those days too. And it came off like bed springs, and it was just hopeless. And I think about today, and I think, how light can I go and still land the fish? if I'm targeting brim in the shallow flats or whatever, and they're a bit shy, and I know that they're going to be hard to nail, can I get away with a 6 pound leader here, or do I need to go to a 4 pound leader? So it's gone completely to the other end, and I realise now that the lighter you go in every aspect of fishing, the more bites you're going to get, the more fish you're going to hook, and that's what underpins my whole finesse philosophy towards fishing. And it doesn't matter if it's marlin on 130-pound gear, if you're trolling your great big lures for blue marlin out of the continental shelf, if you drop down from a 600-pound leader to a 400-pound leader, you're going to get more strikes. Your lure's going to swim better. You're going to catch more fish. Same thing with your hard-bodied lure or your soft plastic for the brim. If you drop down from 8 pound to 6 pound, you're going to get more bites. You're going to hook more fish. Finesse works, but then you've got to trade it off. That's what I call the finesse conundrum. You go too light, you're going to start losing a lot of fish. And there's no point in hooking a whole bunch of fish if you're going to lose them. So you have to somehow find the crossover between that, getting the bite and landing the fish. And that's what the rest of my fishing career has been about. It's been about walking that fine line between finesse and strength. And that's what guides every day that I spend on the water now. My first reaction to any tough fishery is to downsize my lures, downsize my leader, lengthen my leader, always to increase that finesse to the point where I'm going to get the bite or the strike. And then if I lose that fish because I've gone too light, then I take the next step up and hopefully find that point where I'm getting the bites and still able to land the fish. And to me, that's what it's all about.
Exactly. And I agree with that. That's the finesse philosophy we're going to be talking about very soon in the second part of our podcast here. And I guess that's just the taster and the perfect taster to what's going to be coming ahead of us. You've probably been on hundreds of different fishing trips and been to all different parts of the world. What was the most challenging trip? It doesn't have to be where, you spent days and days to catch a fish. It could just be an incident or anything to do with a challenge while fishing.
Well, there's a trip whenever Bushy and I get together, we often reminisce about what we both called the trip from hell. And it was a filming trip. We flew into Lizard Island and we were going on board a charter boat, and we were going to cruise from there up to Princess Charlotte Bay, which is a fair way north of Lizard Island, and anchor up in the bay and then fish in dinghies in the creeks and things. And E.T. was on this trip. As was the late Paul Green, the footballer. And it got off to a bad start. It got off to a bad start before we even got there, because the boat we were supposed to be going on hit a reef the day before and smashed its prop up. So the new prop arrived on the same plane that we did. So they had to fit that. So we were late getting started. And when we got up in the morning to leave the anchorage at Lizard Island to start cruising north, the wind was howling. You could hear all the rigging on all the boats. All the game boats were anchored in there. Everyone's rigging was whistling and rattling against the outriggers, and you could see how rough it was out around the corner. And we were having second thoughts about going. But a game boat skipper, who shall remain anonymous on one of the other boats, called across to us and said, "Come on, are you mice or men? Get out there." So we went. He didn't, as it turned out. We found out later he stayed safely in the anchorage, and we headed off and started cruising up the coast towards Princess Charlotte Bay. Well, it was horrendous. It was blowing a sou'easter, and we were heading north-northwest, so we had it behind us. But even with it behind us, it was just huge, and they were breaking, and they were short. We ended up snapping the cables to the rudder on a couple of occasions and ending up sideways in this massive sea. Like, it was pretty serious stuff. We actually thought at one stage we'd end up losing the boat and having to get rescued. But we made it to Princess Charlotte Bay, and things just went downhill from there. It was just one of those weeks. Nothing worked. We hardly caught a fish. The fish was shut down. Nothing that was supposed to work was going to work. We couldn't even catch mud crabs. And then we had to, at the end of, it wasn't a week, it was about 4 days, and we had to punch back into it. And the sea was just as big on the way back. And I was seasick the whole way. I don't get seasick very often, but it was a huge sea, and we were all pretty crook. And then in the middle of all that, in the middle of worrying about drowning, there was an electrical short in the boat, and the curtains inside the boat caught fire, and we thought we were going to burn to death instead of drowning. So yeah, it's funny now, but it wasn't funny at the time. So that one definitely goes down as the most challenging trip that I've ever been on. The trip from hell.
Exactly. That last little bit there, everyone can handle a bit of choppy swells and just get back safely, but fire is any type of boater's worst enemy.
Absolutely.
And to mix that in with what you guys already had, you must have just thought, oh my God, what type have I walked under a ladder? What have I done to deserve?
Yeah.
And I guess you've mentioned this before, and I guess we can go into a lot more detail now. The biggest fish that you've caught, and what's the story behind it? I'm guessing you're going to be talking about the Canadian bluefin.
Yeah, so hadn't long started work at Fishing World magazine. I started there early in 1981 after my 1 year of teaching. Started as assistant editor, and within 3 months I got elevated to editor because Ron moved up to become the publisher of a couple of the magazines there. And I can still remember, it's clear as a day, I got a phone call one day and I answered the phone, and it was a guy with a Canadian accent, and he introduced himself, and he was from the Canadian Embassy. And he said, "Have you got a passport?" And I said, "Yeah, I have, as a matter of fact," because I'd done my first overseas trip just a few months earlier. I went to New Guinea with my girlfriend at the time. And so I had a passport and I just got one. He said, "Have you ever wanted to fish for giant bluefin tuna in Canada?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sounds fantastic." He said, "Would you like to go?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "When?" He said, "Next Wednesday." Oh, okay. So next Wednesday, I was on a plane bound for the US first and then up into Canada. It was a media tournament. They'd invited magazine editors from all over the world. There were 23 of us from every corner of the world, magazine editors and writers. And they took us to Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia and the eastern maritime provinces of Canada to fish for giant bluefin tuna in a Air Canada Tuna Cup. And just to put it in a bit of perspective, the giant bluefin tuna in the North Atlantic Ocean were in dire straits in those days. They'd been fished right down. There was only a remnant population left, very few fish left. They've bounced back beautifully since then. They've managed them really well, and it's a vibrant fishery again now. But at that stage, it was on its last legs. And as often happens in fisheries that are on their last legs, the only fish that were still being caught were huge. In fact, one of the commercial fishermen there told me the only reason that those fish were still there was because they were too big to be held on longline gear. They would break longline gear. They could only be caught on rod and reel. So we were effectively commercial fishing. These were commercial crews that were fishing for these fish out of old lobster boats, and we were the lucky anglers that got to sit in the chair and fight the fish. But they were wanting to catch them to ship them out to Japan because they were worth a huge amount of money. Anyway, it was an 8-day tournament. There were only 2 fish caught. One was 675 pounds, caught the day before I got mine. And mine was 1,020 pounds, which was 463 kilos, I think, from memory. It was just the most incredible experience trolling for these things. Not very far from shore, where I caught mine in the Straits of Canso in Nova Scotia. I could see traffic on the Trans-Canada Highway crossing over to Cape Breton Island. It's almost, if you could imagine being in Sydney Harbour, probably down towards the lower end of the harbour somewhere. That was the sort of water that we were in, and there were these big schools of their slimy mackerel, Atlantic mackerel, fizzing on the surface, and every now and again these massive tuna would come busting up through. I still remember the first one I ever saw. I called out to the skipper and said, there's two tuna over there. And he said, "What do you mean 2? I said, "Those 2 fins." He said, No, that's its dorsal and that's its tail.
Oh, wow.
And I went, I don't really know if I want to catch one of these things. And blow me down, 10 minutes later, one of them leapt out of the water behind the boat, came down on my bait, which was a swimming, one of these mackerel rigged to swim. The fish actually completely cleared the water. They trolled the baits really short behind the boat. I actually got spray all over shirt or jumper because it was cold from the fish re-entering the water as it took my bait. And I'm sitting in the chair at the time, and the 130-pound outfit beside me just buckled over. They had 45 pounds of drag on the reel, and the line was just melting off this thing. But one of the hardest things I've ever done was getting it out of the rod holder on the side of the chair and getting it into the gimbal. Reasonably shallow water, only about 180, 200 feet deep. So they don't go down. They make screaming big runs, massive runs. And we chased it in the boat. The boats were only capable of about 10 knots. So we weren't able to chase it all that quickly. And 50 minutes it took, and up came this thing, and they sunk the gaffs in, and I still hadn't had a really clear look at the fish. And they said, "Do you want to get out and out of the chair and have a look at your fish?" So I was shaking. I got out of the chair and walked over to the side and looked at this thing. It was 9 feet 10 inches long, 3 meters long, and I forget the girth, but it's just the biggest animal that I'd ever been connected to in my life. It was quite a visceral feeling, and to see it dead or dying, its tail was still just going bang, bang, bang against the side of the boat. I must admit I had sort of mixed feelings about being involved in the death of such an amazing creature, but it was a big income to these guys. They were really stoked. They hadn't caught one for a couple of weeks, and that was in Tokyo the next morning. Got flown out that night, so they did quite well out of it, and I won the Air Canada Tuna Cup in 1981. So, yeah, it was quite an experience, and one that I'll never forget. Like I said, I'll never catch anything that big again in my life. I don't really care. I don't ever want to be connected to something as powerful as that again by a 130-pound line, which is, I was a pretty solid bloke even in those days, and it was pulling me out of the chair and threatening to drag me over the side. It was a scary encounter.
Yeah, I'd imagine the power of a fish that big and the feeling on the rod, like, even just flicking for a big flathead, it's a good flathead, but, you're not going to be pulled out of the boat or anything like that just yet. But like the scale of that fish and the way it would fight would just be a different level. You'd just be like, oh my God, how do I actually even bring this fish in?
Exactly
right. Do you have a favorite fishing spot that you return to often, and why is it special to you?
Well, probably, I often get asked about my favorite fishing spot, and through the early 2000s, the 90s and the early 2000s, I made multiple trips to Cape York in North Queensland. I had a mate who had a liverboard charter boat up there, guy by the name of Greg Bethune, who had a business called Carpentaria Safaris with this lovely liverboard boat. And I used to go up at least once a year. Sometimes I went 2 and even 3 times a year. I think I did something like 23 trips over the decade or so with Greg on the boat down the western side of Cape York. We used to get on it at the very tip of the Cape, and you'd go down towards Weipa and then fish our way back. That country up there is very dear to my heart. It's magnificent country. We used to do a lot of fly fishing. My favourite times were getting out of the boat and walking the beaches up there, walking on the beaches, looking at the creatures, as my mate Ian Miller very succinctly put it. And you'd walk these beaches and look for fish cruising in the shallows and cast flies or lures in front of them. And it's a place I haven't been in 10 years now because Greg hasn't got the business up there anymore. Things have changed. There's a lot more people get up there now than did in those days, but the fishing's still really good. The Cape is a great spot, and it's somewhere I often return to in my mind's eye and in my daydreams and my nighttime dreams. But the last few years, the place completely the opposite end of the country. I've fallen totally in love with Tasmania, and my wife Jo and I get down to Tassie, try to get down there at least once a year, chase the trout in the fresh water and all kinds of things in the salt water. And we absolutely love Tasmania. I often joke to people that I'd live down there if their winter wasn't 10 months long. The weather is appalling. What if you don't like the weather in Tasmania, wait 10 minutes and it'll inevitably get worse. But when you get a halfway decent window, the fishing down there is just amazing. And I think it's because it's got a relatively small population, doesn't get a lot of pressure. There's a lot of fishing opportunities, and just a lot of great places to explore. So yeah, the two ends of the country, Cape York and Tasmania, would be my two favourite fishing destinations in Australia.
Yeah, they're definitely two that are on my bucket list, especially Cape York, the outer reef and stuff like that. Popping for GT,
Oh yes.
all trout, dino trout, all that sort of stuff looks amazing. And then heading down into Tasmania for trout, brim, and winding quiet rivers. Just it looks phenomenal. Like from the episodes that you've uploaded recently from your last trip down there, it just looked picturesque to be able to be fishing down there. And looking at different types of fishing, and for me, fishing not just has an impact on when I actually am out there fishing, it actually has an impact on things outside of my life. So, has fishing impacted your life outside of just catching fish?
Oh, definitely. And I guess, excuse me, I guess the biggest impact there is the fact that my wife, Jo, I actually met her through fishing uh, on one of those squidgy tours. She was a Darwin girl and she came along to one of the squidgy nights up in Darwin. And that's how we met. And very much soulmates. We'd both been married before, but discovered each other late in life. And she's at least as keen on fishing as I am. And it's just wonderful to have a partner who's so into fishing and understands it so well and enjoys it as much as I do. So I think that's probably the biggest gift that fishing's given me, apart from all the wonderful experiences in the fishing itself, is to help me hook up with my life partner.
Yep, I shared the exact same story. My wife, I met her through fishing. She loved fishing, and I was like, "There's no way you actually like fishing." I couldn't believe that she actually was into it. And we went out fishing, and did all that sort of stuff. Fell in love. We're married. Got a lovely, beautiful little 9-month-old baby at the moment. And yeah, watching you and Joe fish on YouTube episodes, it just brings back all the memories that I've created so far. And even the stuff that she's doing in the fishing space with women's fishing is just absolutely phenomenal. And I'd love to have her on the podcast to talk about it one day.
She'd be keen. She'd be really keen to do that. She's just been selected for the Australian women's team in next year's Commonwealth Fly Fishing Championships in England. So she's very excited about that, and she's going into training to. She's going to have to lift her game somewhat in the fly tying department and the trout fishing department to be a part of the team. But she's very, very excited about it.
That's cool. That's so cool to hear. What advice would you give someone just starting out in fishing?
Yeah, I think the advice I give these days to people just getting started in fishing is that it's not as easy as it looks on TV or YouTube or whatever. You only ever, and social media is probably the worst for this. You only ever see people's successful days and smiling over a big, prize catch. There are a lot of times when it can be really, really tough. And I've been doing it for 60 years. And I still go out and have my donut days and draw my blanks and come home disappointed. And I think that is the lesson that I would try and give to people, that it's not easy. You're going to earn your good times, but they are going to come. Every bad day brings you one day closer to that next magnificent day when everything just comes together and the fish want to commit suicide and you have an absolute ball. But it's not an easy game, and you shouldn't get conned into the idea that it's going to be a pushover every time you go fishing. That's probably the biggest lesson that I'd try and get across.
Yep, I'm pretty much the same. It's the chase, and it's the understanding that the fish won't just jump on your hook. You've got to earn it, and the more hours that you put in, the more rewarding that fish will eventually be. And I guess over that 60 years, you spent all this time catching all these different types of fish and amazing fish. Like we went to Canada, caught a 1,000-pound bluefin tuna. Is there a fish that you have not caught yet that you still want to catch?
Yeah, I think that tarpon, I've caught the Australian tarpon, the Indo-Pacific tarpon, oxeye herring, fantastic fish. But those monster ones they get in Florida and Central America, I drool over those. I watched plenty of YouTube videos and stuff of guys catching them, particularly on fly gear, and it's what I guess my only fishing regret is that I never got over there and got to do that, got to actually fish for giant tarpon in the Caribbean or the Atlantic, and I probably won't now. I'm not overly keen on long distance air travel anymore, so I can live without it. And I probably will go to my grave without catching one of those big tarpon, but it is probably my only fishing regret and the only unticked box on my bucket list, and that would have been good. But boy, oh boy, I've had a lot of other great catches over the years, so can't really complain.
Exactly. When we look at it from a holistic perspective and, look at the bucket list, everything's been ticked by one. You got to be pretty happy with that. Speaking of those giant tarpon, if anyone hasn't seen on social media, Paul Worsling actually has been over there the last couple of weeks and managed to get a really, really big one in the last couple of weeks. So that was pretty cool to see on social media and stuff like that.
It was.
But moving on to, I guess, our fishing technique in our specific sections, you decided that you wanted to talk about the finesse philosophy, and I guess you touched on that earlier. Can you briefly explain what finesse fishing is for those who might not be actually familiar with it?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that finesse equates to light, and it can. Light is one of the things that works in finesse fishing, but there's a little bit more to it than that. And I've often written about this, the fact that you can apply finesse to heavy tackle fishing as well. So let's go to the heaviest tackle fishing you can possibly imagine, fishing for massive sharks. Now, when they used to chase sharks back in the 20s and 30s, and this is before things like great whites were protected, when they'd fish for things like great whites and tigers, they'd actually use chain for their leaders. They'd use 10 meters of chain at the end of the rig with a massive forged hook on the end of it and a whole tuna or whatever as a bait. And you catch sharks doing that. There's no doubt about it. And if you do hook one, it's not going to get away. But over the years, as the sharks began to wise up to fishing pressure, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, because I'm a great believer in the fact that fish actually do learn, in inverted commas, but it got harder and harder to catch them that way. So they had to step down to cable wire leaders instead. And then they found that the thinner they went with the cable, the more bites they got from the sharks. But then if they took it too far, the sharks were able to wear through those 49-strand wire leaders during the fight. So you can go too far towards finesse. But the point I'm making is that it's not always about light tackle. It's about making the tackle that you're using for whatever it is that you're targeting a little bit more cunning, longer, lighter, finer. I talk about those kind of things when I talk about finesse. So getting away with not only the skinniest leader that you can get away with, but perhaps the longest leader that you can comfortably cast. If you're fishing braided line, instead of using a rod length or half a rod length of leader, step it up to 2 or even 3 rod lengths of leader so that your braid is further away from your lures. Getting rid of all the garbage that people seem to want to put on their line between the rod tip and the lure or the fly. I see people put up posts with a lovely little hard-bodied lure or a salter for trout or whatever, and they've got a snap swivel attached to the top of it that's longer than the lure itself. Those kind of things, getting rid of all that stuff, the paraphernalia between you and the fish. Nice little example that I give. We've got a lovely boat shed here where I live, right on the water. You can go down and have a coffee and a bacon and egg sandwich right on the edge of the water and see the bream feeding under the jetty and all that sort of thing. And the kids love fishing down there. When my stepdaughter Charlotte was a lot younger, we used to take her down there and she'd fish off the jetty and have a ball catching small bream and blackfish and tailor, sometimes bigger stuff as well, trevally and things. And there was another family there. It was school holidays, and there was another family there one day, and their kids, I could see them getting more and more disappointed. Every time Charlotte pulled a fish in and they weren't pulling a fish in, they wanted to know why. And they're going over to their mum and dad and go, "What's she doing that we're not doing?" Well, I can tell you what she was doing. I'd rigged her up with 4-pound monofilament straight through to a little tiny hook. She had no sinker, and we were putting a little piece of prawn, or actually she was using bacon off her bacon and egg sandwich on the hook, and she's catching fish hand over fist. And I had a look at the way these kids were rigged up, and they had a 1 ounce bean sinker running down onto one of those shop bought 30 centimetre wire traces with a 4.0 hook on the snap swivel at the end of the wire trace and a frozen prawn skewered on that. And they were not going to catch a fish as long as they sat on that jetty. I was able to educate them a little bit and get them to change their rigs, and they caught some fish. But it's a dramatic example, but the difference between what Charlotte was doing and what those kids were doing, and the fact that she was catching fish one after the other, and they might have only been little fish, but they were important to those kids, and those kids weren't catching anything, and they were never going to catch anything while they were fishing like that. And I mentioned before that I firmly believe that fish wise up to fishing pressure, and it was Ron Calcutt way back in the 70s that first sort of started talking about that. He was talking about things like kingfish at the peak of Sydney, and how he believed that they got used to the sound of outboard motors arriving and anchors going over and jigs falling into the water, and they'd hightail it off the prime spots on the peak because they knew they were going to get hammered, and they'd seen their mates getting pulled up, and in those days very rarely let go. So, fish do respond to angling pressure. There's no doubt about it. And I keep coming back to bream. They're kind of my yardstick by which I measure all kinds of other fishing, and bream really wise up to fishing. And to make matters worse, a lot of us prefer to let our bream go, so we're actually releasing fish that we've educated by catching and putting them back into the population. And things like Sydney Harbour, when we first introduced the squidgies, you could go out on a day on the harbour and easily catch 15 or 20 bream on soft plastics around any of the good spots in the harbour. These days, if you're fishing an ABT tournament in the harbour, you might really struggle to get your 5 legal-sized bream to weigh in for the comp. It's not because there's less fish there. There's no commercial pressure on the harbour anymore. Lots of people choose to let those fish go. There's heaps of bream in there. They've just become a lot harder to catch, so we have to apply a little bit more cunning and a little bit more subterfuge and a little bit more of what I like to call finesse to be able to catch them.
Exactly. That story just reminds me of a story that I had. I went up to Darwin for a different event, and I was like, I really need to go fishing. And I had someone that I met at the event actually had a boat, and we decided we'd go out right before my flight. And I had about 2-3 hours to be able to go fish. And I was so used to fishing in Sydney and fishing under lots of, fish pressure and stuff like that, and using that finesse approach and stuff like that. And he hands me a big 4,000 size reel, a 4 to 8 kilo rod with some nice braid and leader and all that sort of stuff on it. And I casted it underneath the mangrove, and I got a little twitch, and he's like, no, just bring it straight back in and cast again. He'll come at it again. And I just left it there for an extra couple of seconds, twitched it a couple of times, and then bang, the rod took off, nearly took it out of my hands. And that sort of finesse approach that I had learned in Sydney, I applied it up into Darwin, and I managed to catch a 60 plus centimetre queenfish. Not an amazing fish, but that story straight away just reminded me of that finesse approach straight away.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good point you make about manipulating the lures as well. But go back to the non-finesse type fishermen will just keep doing the same thing, chucking their lure out, winding it in, chucking it out, winding it in, same speed every cast, and eventually they hope that a fish is going to jump on it and commit suicide. But a finesse fisherman will tweak that lure and work it and see what's going to actually work on the day to push the buttons of the fish and catch them. And that's part of finesse as well. I'll give you another quick little example. Joe and I had only been together for a couple of years, and we did a trip to the Abrolhos off Geraldton in WA. We went out on a charter boat to the Abrolhos Islands. Fantastic part of the world. Gets pretty wild weather, and we had some fairly rough weather while we were out there, but really good reef fishing. We were bottom bouncing with jigs and soft plastic. Well, Joe and I were using jigs and soft plastics. The rest of the crew on board were using bait. And we're catching WA jewfish and big coral trout and snapper and all kinds of amazing stuff. And there were 14 anglers on the boat, and Jo she'd never done that style of fishing before. And she ended up catching the biggest and best of just about every species that was caught on that boat for the 4 or 5 days that we were there. I was probably in second place, and then the other guys sort of went down from there. And I looked at it all at the end of the trip and realised that because she'd never done that before, I didn't want to overload her with really heavy gear. So I gave her a medium weight spin rod, 6,000 size reel spooled up with 20-pound braid. I was using 50-pound braid. The rest of the crew were using 60 and 80-pound nylon. So they're using really thick line on deck winches and, big albies and things like that. Jo caught more fish and better fish than the rest of us because she had the lighter gear. That was as simple as that. It wasn't because of anything that she knew about that style of fishing that we didn't know. It was just purely because her gear had more finesse than anyone else's on board, and she caught more fish. And you just can't argue with results like that.
Exactly. And speaking of gear, is there any particular gear or equipment that you like to use to be able to use this finesse? I know we've talked about before, lighter leaders, smaller jig heads, all that sort of stuff. Is there any specific type of gear that you would recommend for finesse fishing?
Well, I think braided line, if people ask me to nominate the one thing that's changed fishing most in my 60 years of fishing, then it's braided gel spun line. It's made a massive difference. I use braid for about 95% of my fishing. The only time I tend to use mono these days is on sidecast reels because the braid cuts your fingers up too much. And when I'm black fishing, float fishing for blackfish, I usually use mono. Well, I have used braid there too, and it works quite well. But I use braid for just about everything else. And to me, it's the epitome of finesse fishing because it's fine but strong. It's allowed us to go to this super skinny line that's also very, very strong and effective. We can hold the fish when we get them. I always use a leader, fluorocarbon or nylon monofilament at the end of the braid, but just having that braid allows me to cast further. It's less affected by the water. It's less affected by the wind. It transmits the bites better. I'm more able to set the hook. It's just completely revolutionised my fishing. And to me, it's what smart finesse fishing is all about, is the clever use of braided main lines.
Yeah, exactly. I agree 1000% with that because, of the times where I do go back to a monofilament only reel, it feels so weird. It feels like you're disconnected from the rod. You're disconnected from fishing. That braided line and the sensitivity of it just makes you such a better angler because of it. And the ability to be able to detect those tiniest bites. And especially like even, for example, snapper fishing in shallow reefs, and you've got swell to deal with, you've got wind to deal with, you've got current to deal with. I couldn't imagine doing that on just monofilament line at all.
Absolutely.
Is there, let's talk about, I guess, if you were to go out finesse fishing, what would be like your dream setup, like specific brands, products, and all that sort of stuff that you would do?
Well, I'm a Shimano man. I've been a Shimano man for 35 years, so I tend to only fish with Shimano gear. I think it's fantastic. I guess the one thing that does annoy me a little bit about them is they keep bringing new stuff out every year and discontinuing the old stuff that I really loved, so you've got to sort of, I have to keep up with the new stuff so that I can talk about it and do videos on it and everything. But seriously, if you had a 5-year-old Shimano reel, you're not going to be disadvantaged by someone that's got one of the newer models. So yeah, I love the spin reel technology these days. When I was growing up, spin reels were disparagingly called egg beaters or coffee grinders or whatever. I can still remember my first trip to the Northern Territory in 1981, and if you were seen up there with a spin reel, you were either a beginner or a Victorian or probably both. Everybody used bait casters. Real men used bait casters. Now you go up there, and a lot of them are running spin reels, 90% of the time for their barra fishing. And don't get me wrong, I love my bait casters. I prefer to catch a big fish on a bait caster than any other style of gear, but spin reels is certainly not a disadvantage these days. And the rods, second only to braided line, would be the responsive graphite rods. I first encountered graphite rods as early as the early 70s, and they were pretty fickle in those days. They were very easy to break. They were expensive, but you could already feel how good it was going to be when they got the technologies sorted out. And these days, graphite rods or graphite composite rods. They're so light, so responsive, and they just work so well with the braided lines and the sophisticated spinning reels that we've talked about.
Yep, exactly right. I agree with you 100% there. What's some of your go-to finesse fishing techniques? Like, are you using, I know we've got, lightly weighted jig heads. Are we casting that at snags and all that sort of stuff? And I guess tying that into the other part of the question, I guess, your typical finesse fishing setup for different conditions. So if you had an ideal spot, what would it be like, and what type of technique would you use?
Yeah, well, I use quite a lot. As you can imagine, I use a lot of different gear depending on where I'm fishing and what I'm doing. But I'm always a stickler for making sure that it's balanced, making sure that it feels good in the hand and it's responsive. I love my little spin reels. I use 1,000 size spin reels a lot, which is a little bit unusual. A lot of even the tournament brim anglers and that will use 2,500 size reels. And I know there are advantages. You've got a bit more cranking power, you've got a bit more drag pressure. They probably cast a tiny bit further because the spools are that little bit bigger. But I love the way a 1,000 reel balances with these modern graphite rods. I'm a bit of a fan of probably a little bit longer than normal rods. I was one of the first ones in the brim circuit to start going for the 7'6", 7'10". We even went up to 8-foot type rods for throwing particularly lightly weighted soft plastics. I found that extra length gave me that little bit more distance when I was casting, but also the ability to stay in touch with the lure and to pick up the slack and set the hook when I did get a really light take and things like that. So I tend to fish. I remember back in the nylon days, in the 80s and early 90s, probably the single most popular spin rod length was either 6 foot or 6'6". Now it's kind of moved up to 7 foot, 7'3", 7'6". I think part of that's because of braid. It's nice to have that little bit more shock absorption there in the longer rod, but also it does give you that ability to cast a little bit further and have a little bit more control over your gear. So yeah, balanced gear, small reels, longish rods, long fine leaders. That's what my fishing's all about these days.
Yep, exactly. I agree with the long rod idea. A lot of the rods that I have currently are well over 7 foot and often around that 7'6" mark, purely because they are just so much easier to use to put it, to either just to be able to cast a lure or hook set a fish, whatever it is. I just feel like the longer the rod that you can get within reason, there's obviously a level to it. We're not going to 11 foot for a 1 to 2 kilo rod because that just won't actually work. But yeah, definitely 100% agree with that. The length of rod almost behind the idea of braided line are like the two biggest things for me when I'm finesse fishing. And I'm no professional finesse fisherman. I'm not the greatest one going around. It's definitely helps me 100%. So that's a great little tip to be able to pass on to our listeners. And I guess moving on a little bit, we're talking about a little bit of locations and stuff. Now, let's talk about our river fishing locations. What would be the ideal finesse fishing spot to be able to go and use this technique to increase our catch rate?
The thing I always talk to people about when you're looking for prime spots in an estuary or whatever is to combine three factors. You want water movement, you want structure, and you want bait. So something for the fish to eat, structure for them to relate to, and water movement, be it current, tide, or whatever, to accumulate all that in one spot. So I'm always looking for the optimum combination of those three things. Now, obviously, in freshwater or a system that's not open to the sea, you can virtually rule out the water movement, although you're still going to get movement because of things like wind and so forth. But in an estuary, and I fish estuaries probably 80% of the time, I'm looking for that optimum combination of water movement, bait, and structure, and that'll tell me where the fish are going to be. Aggressive, active fish are usually on the up current edge of structure, where the water hits that structure and splits and goes around it. That's a prime spot. Throw in some bait in that area, and you're looking at an absolutely magic spot. Structure, bait, and water movement. Those are your three keys.
I love that, to be able to break it down into three easy to understand sections and be able to, like, again, that front edge of that piece of structure is always where the bigger fish are going to be hanging. They want first dig at whatever's coming past. They don't want the scraps at the back end. And that's a scenario that someone that I went fishing with years and years ago taught me. They're like, the bigger fish, they're the first ones in line. They're going to bully all the small fish out of the way. So if you're not fishing that front edge of that structure, you're not going to be hitting the bigger fish at all. And I guess heavily fished waters and all that sort of stuff, we've talked about that, I guess. And what, apart from just going lighter in our leader and stuff like that, what else could we do to handle that fish pressure?
Hang back further from the fish, make longer casts. I think that's something that a lot of people forget. They want to get right up on top of the fish. Electric motors allow us to do that. We can get right in and fish the snags from up nice and close, but the fish become aware of the boat. They become aware of the electric motor, and they can be a lot harder to pin when you're up close to them. So I like to hang well back off the structure, at least for my first couple of casts. I'll work my way in closer later on, perhaps. But yeah, hanging back that little bit of extra distance, just keeping things quiet, not dropping tackle boxes in the bottom of the boat. It's fun down in this part of the world. You come Christmas holidays or whatever, you can hear the anchor chains rattling over the gunnels of the boat from hundreds of meters away, and you just think, oh, that spot's going to take a little while to settle down after that bloke just put his anchor in. Then he sits there for 10 minutes and pulls his anchor in and then pulls the whole chain over the gunnel again on the way in, and you think, I might not fish that spot for a little while. Fish are awake up to that sort of stuff.
Yep, 100%. There's nothing worse than even someone driving over your spot. Living in Sydney, it can be often quite a issue, and having to be able to move often and have A, B, C, all the way down to Z spots often is such a big thing to be able to have. So that's something I would definitely add, making sure that, we are finesse fishing. It's such a cool thing to be able to do. Make sure you have those spots that you can head to when you might have dropped a tackle box, like you said, or you might have just made a massive loud yahoo after you caught this huge fish and you've spooked every fish within 500 meters of the spot. And I guess on that, is there a memorable finesse fishing experience or story that you have? I know I certainly have one, but I'd rather regale with your stories.
Well, I guess I jumped the gun on that by telling you the one about Joe at the Abrolhos, because that's the one I often use as an example. A female angler who'd never done that style of fishing before on a boat full of quite proficient anglers, for her to top score on everything. And it was just purely because of the gear. I mean, she had enough talent to be able to land the fish that she was hooking, but she was hooking a lot more fish than anyone else on that boat. So that is the one that I hark back to.
Yep, exactly. I agree 100%. My finesse fishing story, I guess, is more of a fluke rather than actual finesse fishing, because I wasn't even targeting this fish at all. I was casting a very lightly weighted flick bait style soft plastic at some schools of salmon, and I just cast it and my phone went off. So I quickly looked down to see what the notification was, and the lure had sunk below where the salmon were. And I just started winding it back in, and then all of a sudden, bang, on comes a 119 centimeter jewfish. I was on a 1 to 2 kilo rod. I had a 2000 size reel. I had 8 pound braid and 6 pound leader, and I still managed to successfully bring it. It nowhere near finesse fishing or finesse fishing technique. I think it was a bit of luck, like you're saying, but you just never know. Maybe a jewfish wouldn't have bit at all, just purely because I had that light finesse style approach.
Exactly.
And I guess moving on to the future of finesse fishing, how do you actually see this evolving over the next, say, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, it's exciting to think about, really. I wonder what the next breakthrough. I mean, I identified braided line as being the biggest breakthrough I've seen in my fishing career, and that's quite a long time ago now. I mean, I got my first spool of braid in the '80s. We haven't had quite as significant a breakthrough, I don't think, in terms of tackle since then. So maybe there's something lurking out there. Who knows? It'll be, we might come up with. I often think it'd be wonderful if you had hooks that were made from a clear ceramic that were as strong as metal but were actually invisible. They'd be pretty hard to tie on, though. I haven't thought that one through. Um, but yeah, stuff like that. I mean, the leaders are getting finer. Braided lines are getting skinnier all the time, down to the point where we probably don't need to get them any skinnier now. But it's hard to know. And I mean, if I knew, I'd go out and buy the company that makes it, and I'd be a millionaire. But
Exactly.
yeah, I think it'll just keep moving in that finesse direction. Um, and fishing is getting harder. There's this constant thing where the gear's getting better and the fishing's getting harder. So we have to sort of stay one step ahead of the game and always be that little bit smarter than the fish.
Exactly, exactly. Even like looking at things like live scope and stuff like that, and how that could be a thing towards finesse fishing over the next couple of years. Because live scope, I guess, in Australia is a relatively new thing. It's been around for a few years now, but not everyone has access to it, and the costs that are associated with being able to use a live scope machine and stuff like that. But I'm presuming as the years get on, the cost of live scope and stuff like that will become less and less, and it'll be more accessible to the daily angler.
I think so. Yeah, you'll get more bang for your buck, and the technologies will keep improving too. So you'll be able to. But the point I always make is seeing them and catching them are two very different things. And the more fish get hammered by live scope, the more I think they become a wake up. The Murray cod fishery is a classic example of that, where the guys are finding now that they're seeing lots of cod in places like Copeland, but converting them into biters is getting harder and harder. We used to throw big, noisy stuff at them, spinner baits and big surface lures and things. They watch them on the live scope now. When a lure like that lands and starts to move, the cod just swim away from it. So they're having to finesse big soft plastics, get them into the water with the minimum amount of splash, and make the most realistic presentation possible to get the bite. So it's the old finesse conundrum again.
Mm.
You can find them, but you still got to be able to catch them.
And I guess the last question that a few people might be thinking about is our knots and stuff like that. Because as you get lighter in lines and gel spun braided line and leaders and stuff like that, people get more scared about them breaking. So what's your braid to leader knot, and then the knot that you will tie to your jig head or your lure?
Again, that's sort of evolved over the years. When I first started using braid with mono leaders, we just used a double uni knot. And to be honest with you, I'll still revert back to a double uni knot quite often out in the boat in the heat of the moment if I've just been busted off and I need to re-rig or whatever. But I do love I went through the Slim Beauty thing and they were good knots, but I use an FG now. When I rig up at home and I'll rig 3 or 4 outfits before I head out, they've all got immaculately tied 22 turn FG knots on them. Then I get out there, snag one up and break it off and quickly tie a double uni and catch the best fish of the day. So you've got to be confident in your knots. You've got to know the ones that you're tying nice and strong. Not enough people test their knots, actually break them and see how strong they are. I'm reasonably confident about most of my knots. I know that my well-tied FGs are probably right up there at 100%. A good double uni tied in the boat is probably 92% or something like that. So I'm reasonably confident, but there's nothing like an FG for going through those guides. That's what I like most about it, is the fact that it casts without even a tick going through the guides, whereas even the best double uni, there's that little tick tick as it goes through the guides.
Yeah, I share similar things. I tied double unis for up until, I guess, what would it be, 5 or 6 years ago now, where I started then tying FG knots. I used the bobbin, I've used lots of different things, and I managed to be able to find a really easy, quick way to tie an FG knot. Unlike you, 22, I do 24 wraps most of the time. Like I said, things in threes, it's either 24, 21, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, it's such a good one. And I guess that sort of concludes that finesse fishing section. And firstly, I want to thank you, Steve, for coming on to the podcast. I know I said this in private just before, but I feel like I should share my appreciation that I have for you. You're, I guess, my fishing hero growing up as a little kid, to now it's someone who has the first digit in their ages starts with a 3 now. I I can't thank you enough for what you've done for the fishing community, and especially to be able to come on the podcast and have a chat with me. I've never met you before, and you were more than willing to come on the podcast. And it's you were the number one on the bucket list that I had of list of people, and yeah, I can't thank you enough.
Oh, well, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. And, yeah, I like to think I've given a bit to fishing over the years, but fishing's given a hell of a lot to me too. It's given me a fantastic life. As I said, I just turned 66. I've been fishing since I was 5 years old, and it's been a remarkable journey, and it ain't over yet.
Exactly, exactly. And I guess to wrap up, like you said at the start of the episode, your sort of fishing has changed over time, and you've now begun to post on YouTube quite consistently and stuff like that. So here's your chance to throw out where everyone can find you.
Yeah, well, I'm really putting a lot of effort into my YouTube journey now. So my Starlo Gets Real, that's REEL, Starlo Gets Real YouTube channel. I'm posting on content on there weekly now, at least once a week. So there's a lot of new stuff going up there, and it seems to be getting a lot of support and a lot of followers, and people are really, really enjoying it. And Starlo's Fishertopia on both Facebook and Instagram. I'm fairly active on there as well. So yeah, anyone that wants to jump on and say good day. But in particular, if you haven't checked out that YouTube channel yet, do have a look at Starlo Gets Real, because I think if you have a look through some of my back catalogue stuff, you'll find something that interests you. I cover just about everything except probably full-on blue water game fishing, which I don't do much of these days. I did heaps of it when I was a young bloke, but I'm a bit over that now. So there's a lot of estuary, a lot of freshwater, a lot of beach, a lot of rock, a lot of brim, a lot of trout, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, check it out.
Thank you. No worries. And we'll see you all in the next one.